This patch might be the most aggressive swing the Marvel Snap dev team has taken in a very long time. We've seen buffs to underperforming Season Pass cards before, but this is a Season Pass card that is released in a state that is not its final state. It doesn't have all of the cards that it wants to be going with, so it's actually very surprising to me to see such an aggressive buff to Zombie Scarlet Witch. But I will say it is a welcome surprise. I think this is probably what Zombie Scarlet Witch needs, and what the zombie package needs. Going her to 3/4 is a very reasonable buff to this card. 3/2+2 was comparing unfavorably with stuff like Elsa Bloodstone. When you're making a Season Pass card that is meant to be the linchpin of an archetype, you want it to at least be better than what people are already doing with the cards that go with it, such as Kitty Pryde. I think that this is definitely giving it a real niche as a sort of Kitty Pryde spells kind of card. This also makes it a lot easier to play cards that get targeted by Merlin spells on the Zombie Scarlet Witch lane. At 3/2, she was very often the target of both Polymorph and Once in Future, so this not only gives her more base power, but allows her to define herself as a card that has a niche that is not just the niche that Elsa Bloodstone already exists in. This card now has more built-in synergy with cheap spells. The Hunger just dropped thanks to the Sanctum Showdown event, and there is still one card yet to come out for this zombie horde package. So I think that on the whole, I'm happy with this, but it is worth talking a bit about the historical precedent for this. The historical precedent for in-season buffs of a Season Pass card is fairly limited. Typically, it happens towards the end of the season. For it to happen in the first OTA of the season means that either this card is underperforming in a meaningful way, or they're really unhappy with how this archetype ends up looking. I think it's probably both. Zombie Scarlet Witch is fairly weak, but also if she's the card you're building around, your entire archetype will end up fairly weak as well. And while I do think they structured this season fairly well in the context of it is not fully reliant on the zombie horde package to actually make sense, and there are still other cards in this season that are unrelated to the zombie horde package, I do think it's probably a good idea to make sure that there's plenty of power in the Horde deck, because it's fairly unlikely, in my view, that this deck ever gets any new cards before next October when they feel the need to do another Halloween season. Horde with specifically zombies is just not the kind of thing that's going to show up a lot of places in the Marvel universe, so I think that this deck is going to have to stand on its own after this season. And if you want it to be able to stand on its own after this season, you're going to have to put some fairly aggressive stat lines on these cards. And I think that's what's happening here. 3/4 is not the world's most aggressive stat line, but it is a fairly exciting one, and it gives this card a real chance at being the best in slot option in various different forms of decks. Right now, I'm looking pretty hard at the Ika shell for this kind of card. The, of course, Merlin, Zombie Mr. Fantastic, Zombie Scarlet Witch with a Werewolf Annihilus shell. That seems fairly potent to me, and of course the traditional Mysterio Kitty Pryde stuff will probably make a pretty decent amount of sense. What the Zombie Horde archetype needs is to be able to put a lot of power on the board such that it can be the backbone of a deck. That will give it the ability to play tech and adapt to the metagame. Making this card stronger is the first step towards that. But if that were the only buff to the Zombie Horde package, I wouldn't be calling this as aggressive as I am. The other thing that's happening is Zombie Power Man is effectively gaining 3 power here. So he's gaining a piece of base power, and then his Horde trigger is also getting bigger. And the Horde trigger counts for 2 power on him because it adds a power to the Horde, and it also copies the Horde's power. So effectively, this guy is gaining 3 power baseline in this OTA, where Zombie Scarlet Witch is gaining 2. In other words, they have added a full 5 power to this package, which in my opinion is the most aggressive buffs to an archetype they have ever done, and they have done it very quickly into this season. I think mostly that this is a good thing. It's good that the new archetype is getting power injected into it, and I think it's also a fairly low risk place to put power. That's what I really wanted to talk about. Why are the zombies such a low risk place to put power? It's because they aren't able to go exponential in a very meaningful way right now. Now, I have had some success trying to do some things of the Bastion My Horde nature, and that's been like a pretty interesting way to get extra value out of this, but mostly the zombie decks play pretty fair. This guy compares to a Darkhawk or to a Devil Dinosaur. Zombie Scarlet Witch compares to an Elsa or to a Bishop. Those are pretty fair cards to be playing and are very unlikely to actually ruin or dominate a game. What makes those cards compelling is usually the way they are able to carry your point package on their own, while also allowing you space in the deck to play tech. I think it's actually very low risk then for them to put a bunch of power on Zombie Giant Man, because he's the guy that's the biggest, the most investment, the strongest guy in terms of numbers, but the guy who has the most competition in terms of what am I playing this instead of. Zombie Giant Man is competing with Cannonball, he's competing with Juggernaut, he's competing with a lot of end game amazing cards, and so he just needs to be stronger, full stop. And I think that this will do a pretty decent amount for him. This is just a very solid and powerful thing to be doing. One of the things that came up with this card is maybe we actually can start looking at the idea of Arnim Zolaing it or Grandmastering it or using Absorbing Man on it. That kind of stuff seems fairly compelling. Grandmaster especially kind of interesting in a world where people are playing Zombie Scarlet Witch. This is the kind of thing that I think is a very safe buff, because these kind of cards, these really good stats cards, are typically mostly problematic in concert with really good tech. And one of the things that's happened a lot recently in Marvel Snap is tech has been getting progressively weaker, clunkier, more expensive, and less powerful. And so I think a lot of people have this idea that when there's like a really good 3-drop that's just like actually a 3/12, that's busted. But it's only really busted when those decks can also play a bunch of cheap and powerful tech. And that's not necessarily happening right now. And this guy, even if you make him like absolutely maximally powerful, I find it hard to figure out scenarios where he's, I'd rather be doing this than Devil Dinosaur. I can buy that, but like, is that gonna break the metagame? No, being stronger than Devil Dinosaur is exactly what a 5-drop needs to be. And so you end up with a card that I think is a very safe place to put power, an archetype that I think is a very safe place to put power, and frankly, as aggressive as I think this move is, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't actually insanely meaningful, because there are still so many decks in this current metagame that are able to scale multiplicatively. What I am kind of interested in is how the matchup ends up looking against Supergiant stuff, because I think Supergiant is still pretty good against anything trying to do various Zombie Scarlet Witch things, but this being revealed late is kind of sick nasty, to be honest with you. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, certainly. And also you have this ability to generally get some decent numbers over the course of the game, which I think is pretty interesting. But in a world where Supergiant isn't policing these combo decks, which I think is largely the world Ladder exists in, Golden Gauntlet aside, I think the world Ladder exists in is a little bit different right now. There's just a lot going exponential in such a way that you'll feel kind of stupid for playing like a 5/17, which is probably what the upside of this guy is. Like, it'll be pretty solid at beating other mid-range decks probably, but I don't really see it being like, barring its ability to, like, unless there's a good way to get all the tech in there, which maybe there is, I'm not sure how optimistic I am for this package, which is crazy considering it just got 5 points. I think you could argue this is also a pretty solid buff to the Horde archetype. Shadow King going to 3/4 instead of its current 2/2. I think there's probably a good lesson here to be learned, because I think largely the reaction to this will be, Shadow King is super unplayable now. And yeah, kind of, but the difference, like what you want to point out here is, why is that? Why is going from 2 cost to 3 cost such a big deal when it's gaining 4 power? It's arguably closer to being on curve now. And the biggest answer is, on turn 6, you can pair a card like Shadow King at 2 cost with way more cards than you can pair it at 3 cost. This is the baseline answer. Like, this is a card that you're playing mostly for its effect anyway. You don't care too much about what it's doing in terms of its own power to a lane. You're really only playing it because it does what it says on it, and hopefully the doing of that will just be the win in that lane anyway, because when you play this card, you're playing it expecting there to be a lane-winning amount of green power to remove, something like a zombie giant man, for example. Now, that is a reasonable thing to think, and I think it is pretty plausible, but the more I think about it, the more I think, 3/4 Shadow King probably isn't that bad. Like, it's part of the trend that I'm talking about, though, where a lot of the times a problematic scaler or a problematic amount of power on an early card is problematic because of what it can do when paired with very on-rate tech. Old Shang-Chi, Enchantress at 4. We were zabuing those. They cost 3. This card costs 2. And so as things get more inflationary in that way, as you lose the ability to remove your opponent's power very, very cheaply, there is less of a stress in this game on whether or not you are able to have a good early scaler. Is a 310 broken? I mean, when your opponent is playing Moonstone Captain Carter, your 310 doesn't matter at all. And so the more this kind of stuff gets nerfed, the more we move towards combo-ish metas. Not fully combo metas, but metagames where you have to say, take a mid-range deck with 2 pieces of tech in it, and if you get the wrong pieces of tech, you'll get a bunch of losing matchups. And I'm not sure that's how much, I'm not sure I love it. I'm going to be honest with you, but I am interested to see where it goes. And I think it's worth explicitly calling out this dynamic while it's happening. Tech is getting more expensive, harder to pair with other cards, and generally that allows for more things that do more points, which is interesting. I think that, like, right now, for example, playing just a stock ongoing Moonstone list is as viable as it's ever been, in large part because you're dodging the common tech people are playing. And that kind of cycling in a metagame is almost like a cheat code to having things be different on a week-to-week basis as people adapt. Marvel Snap is a game that prides itself on that already, so I can see why this makes sense. But when you think about what we had only a few short months ago in terms of tech cards, 4-cost Enchantress, Shang-Chi that blew up everything, this thing costs 2, and you think about where we are now, I think you can understand why small ball scalers like Zombie Scarlet Witch might just not be a big problem to make anymore. And that's kind of the thing that really strikes me about this change, even though obviously it does strike me as something that is, well, okay, this will make Zombie Scarlet Witch better in the short term, but the long-term trend here is one that seems to be moving away from scalers as a thing that really matters as your vehicle for your game-winning tech. I kind of wonder if this is going to hold up. Like, I wonder if we're sort of entering a new paradigm here. When we talk about tech getting less relevant and scalers being less relevant, I think it's important to talk about, like, this card being a lot of the context for why. What are you going to do with your 310 against the Invisible Woman Voltron deck? The answer is Cosmic Ghost Rider them or nothing, but now you also have the answer of you can also actually play Lady Deathstrike. So Invisible Woman First Steps, losing 2 points of power down to 3/3. I think this is fine. I personally don't have any issue with taking the points away from Invisible Woman First Steps, but I will say I do think the timing is a little bit suspect. I don't understand the point of doing this now after people have gotten to the point of playing Supergiant to beat this. It just sort of seems like, all right, I mean, I guess, but it seems like a pretty balanced deck right now. Largely, though, when you zoom out and you talk about this card, it is worth noting that she is sort of patient zero of why have scalers mattered less. It's not just tech being worse. It's also that part of the reason tech is worse is that this deck exists and there aren't a lot of great tech cards for it outside of the ones that cost 5 and maybe arguably Super Adaptoid, but I'm not sure how much I buy that. So what you have with Invisible Woman First Steps is a deck that has a mid-range game plan with a combo endgame. that has traditionally been pretty problematic, and a decent amount of that is that when she is playing the mid-range game, a 3/5 that doubles your abilities is just a little bit too good at playing the mid-range game. This puts her much more firmly in the combo archetype, and it sort of does really stress the 5s, though. And that's the thing that really sticks out about why scalers are less good, is that there's not just Invisible Woman First Steps that's like, oh, you need a specific 5 to beat this. Iron Man stuff, you need a specific 5 to beat this. And so you end up with multiple decks, and I don't really think there's a deck that can afford to cover all of those. I don't think there's a deck that can play Enchantress and Cosmic Ghost Rider. Maybe Arishem can, but by definition, it's not reliable enough. And so you end up sort of just choosing one of these combo decks is going to combo me out. And you just have to live with that. And I think that's a really interesting space for them to exist in. Maybe there is a deck that can do it. I don't know. I haven't played on this patch, so I obviously wouldn't know. But it just sort of feels like generally this is part of the thing where it's like decks are being asked a lot. There's a lot being asked of you, right? You can get comboed on in a million different ways. This card, you don't have Cosmic Ghost Rider for it. Well, take a bunch of points to the dome off my Omega Sentinel, and then I'm also making, a 24 power Athena or whatever. If you're missing something along the lines of Enchantress, well, that Moonstone Lane is going to have 75 power in it, and that's not even the one they have the Iron Man in. If you don't have things of a nature to deal with Destroy, well, they're going to have a million points on you. And I think largely a lot of people are still stuck in the mode of like, oh, I'm going to play Tech Soup. And I just don't think, I think the threats are too varied and the answers are too expensive for that to be something that you really want to do, barring special circumstances like Thanos or Arishem or whatever, like something that can really subsidize you in that way that's like unique and powerful. I don't know if Tech Soup is going to even be around. But one card this card makes me really want to consider looking at is Lady Deathstrike. I mean, this is a great Lady Deathstrike target. This and Jocasta both dying to a Lady Deathstrike. You can hit Iron Man with Lady Deathstrike. You can hit the Captain Carter with Lady Deathstrike. You can hit a bunch of stuff with Lady Deathstrike that does strike me as fairly compelling, no pun intended. I'm not saying this is the Lady Deathstrike patch, but I do think it's nice that they went to 3/3 instead of 3/4 because that does matter. Speaking of 3/3 instead of 3/4, I think this one's just overdue. Mobius back to 3/3. It is the Lady Deathstrike patch. I'm not saying it's the Lady Deathstrike patch, but if I were to say it was the Lady Deathstrike patch, I if someone else said that, I might agree with it. This is long overdue. Mobius should never have been a 3/4. Mobius being at 3/4 was I don't know what happened there. It can get Lady Deathstruck now. Big fan of that, but just more than that, it's not a free roll anymore. Mobius being a 3/4, just let it go into whatever, and it hits so many things, so many different locations, so many different strategies. Absolute free roll. People are going to look at this and be like, it's a buff to Mr. Negative, and yeah, sure, whatever. But I kind of still think people are going to be playing this card. It's just too good at doing what it does, such that the point that it had on that made it too free. I still honestly kind of wonder if 3/3 Mobius is in a little bit of a free roll. The card is just excellent, and it has done such an effective job at policing any kind of discounts out of the metagame. When's the last time someone played a She-Hulk on you? When's the last time someone played a Sarah deck against you? It's just, there's so much less of that stuff because this card went to 3/4. I still think it's going to be policing those cards perfectly fine at 3/3, but at least it won't be in every mid-range deck ever. I have advocated for a Rogue buff to 3/3 or 3/4 for a while now. I'm glad they are getting her up to 3/3. I think this is one of those cases where I want her to sort of not fully fill the role of Old Enchantress, but partially fill the role of Old Enchantress. The problem Rogue runs into is you are very rarely in a position to benefit from your opponent's ongoing cards. It can happen, but it's not the most common outcome with this. A lot of the time, what you're doing is just using her to turn off an ongoing card. Okay, yeah, in the V-Hand Mirror, this is great, But if you're not playing V-Hand, all you're doing is turning off their V-Hand. And so it's like, all right, a lot of the time, the steal part of this card, not actually impactful. And so I feel like she has a bit of a threshold to get over before people actually start putting her in decks because of this. And I think that that largely is something that gives her room to be even stronger. So 3/3 to me, a fairly anodyne milquetoast buff, like, just seems like something that should happen. I'm very happy that it did happen, but I do think they could have stood to be a little bit more aggressive with this card. Maybe. Again, I've talked a lot about the ways in which they've kept tech in check and explicitly seemingly have done so in this way. I think maybe not overbuffing Rogue could be part of that strategy. Firelord is going to 4/7. I have very little to say about this other than good for Firelord. Happy for you. Not reading all that. I'm sad for you, or happy that it happened. I don't know. I'm butchering the meme right now, but yeah, this card is going to do exactly the same stuff it was doing previously. There are like some reasonably funny things that you can do with it, like reviving stuff off of, like, you know, after you gambit it or whatever in your surfer deck. There's like entertaining enough stuff to do, like a pseudo Phoenix Force for your Cassandra Nova in that deck that just spams Cassandra Novas. It's not the end of the world, but it's just like, this is just a free point of power that probably doesn't change too much about this card. I had to put the cat down for this one because I feel pretty strongly about this one. I don't think they did enough for Warlock. And I realize they're like, okay, let's 3/4 it. It's like not that good. I think Warlock is an incredibly safe place to put power. And I largely think that it's a safe place to put power because what it's doing fundamentally is just not all that strong. In other words, I would have 3/5'd this card. I think that's what you're supposed to do. So why is it so safe to put power on Warlock? Well, at best, what Warlock is doing is letting you play a bunch of cards on the final turn of the game very cheaply. It's doing Hitmonkey, it's doing She-Hulk, it's doing Sunspot, right? Those are the things that it's doing. But when you build that deck, with an understanding that you won't always have Warlock. So it ends up with a fairly limited point capacity anyway. Even when you do everything you want to do, you're doing She-Hulk stuff, you're doing all this stuff, you're limited not just by the size of your own cards, you're not going exponential the way other decks are, but also by the fact that you have to have a deck that functions when you don't do that. And so what that means is, while Warlock may look like an extremely powerful card, it just kind of isn't in terms of the output you're actually getting. So my thought process is, if you want me to play this card, I want it to be a 3/5. And I really want to play this card. I think it's cool. I think it's interesting. I would want to play this kind of stuff. And then you get into the Mobius of it all. And it's like, okay, if I am going to, with clear eyes, queue up a deck that gets absolutely bananas dumped on by Mobius, why would I queue up the Mobius deck with the lowest output? And I think you could give Warlock players a good answer to that if you made this a 3/5. Why am I queuing the Mobius deck with the lowest output when I do my combo? Because it has the highest output when I don't. So I get to have this sort of like Invisible Woman first steps-ish gameplay. We don't get nearly to that level of points, which is another thing that sticks out about Warlock, of just like, oh, I have a lot of points here. I beat mid-range decks when I do my combo, and then when I get to play like a mid-range deck when someone interacts with my combo. That's a really cool space for the stuff to be in. At 3/4, it's just not doing that. And so I just think they undershot this one. Like, if I'm going to play a Mobius loss, if I'm going to queue up an auto loss to Mobius, which you definitely are when you play Warlock She-Hulk, I'm going to do it with one of the ones that at least wins when I don't get Mobius, right? And so I think this is just a little bit of a miss from me. I personally think they should have gone a little bit more aggressive on Warlock. That's just where I'm at. It just seems like such a safe place to put power because it's never going to have like a Mr. Negative level of output. It's going to have a very capped level of output because you have to build the deck to function when it doesn't have Warlock or doesn't have She-Hulk or doesn't have Sunspot or whatever. And I just think that that is ultimately the failing of this buff. I don't think it's going to do enough for this card, and I think they should have been more aggressive. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Let me know what you think about this video, the content of it, and the cards that were changed in the comments. I still read them all. I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful evening.